I'm sure you're the one who can shed a little bit of light and understanding for all of us on these very, very vexed issues in this corona world. Mike, the screen is yours to kick off on China and the Middle East, ongoing challenges for the next US administration. And ladies and gentlemen, Mike will handle your wide range of questions. Mike, welcome.
Hi, well, thank you for that introduction, Colin, and thank you, Joel, and thanks to AIJAC for hosting this. It's especially appropriate that I'm talking about this subject, China and the Middle East, to AIJAC, because it was the trip that you hosted for me when I came to Australia that really awakened my concern about China. You guys were ahead of the curve. I think you were ahead of the United States in understanding the full dimensions of the China threat. And it was really as a result of that trip that I started to ask myself a little bit more seriously what China's role in the Middle East was. So I sat down with a colleague of mine at the Hudson Institute, Peter Rao, to start just cataloging all of the activities of the Chinese in the Middle East and try to make sense of it from Beijing's point of view. And what we found really surprised me and alarmed me, to be honest. For me, engaging in this research, it was, on one level, it was one of the most exciting intellectual endeavors of mine in years, in the sense that I felt like I knew something about the Middle East after having studied it for years and worked in government and so on. But trying to figure out what the Middle East looks like from China's point of view was like looking at a different projection of the map. You know, you get used to looking at when you were in school at the Mercator projection of the map of the world. Of course, in school in America, the United States is always right in the center of the map. It seems very big. And then if you look at one of these other projections from you know, from the Arctic or from some other point of view, the world looks very different. And suddenly, when I was doing this work, the Middle East started to look very different. And I came across some very surprising things that I did not know, and I was embarrassed I didn't know them. For example, what country has China increased its investment in the most in recent years? So there's one country between 2010 and 2018, China has increased its investment in that country by over 1,000%. And it surprised me. If you'd asked me what it was, I might have said Saudi Arabia, I might have said the UAE, possibly Iran. But no, it's Iraq. It's been investing in Iraq. I started also thinking about what the Middle East means to China. And that took me to the, very quickly, to the Uyghur question and the genocide of the Uyghurs. Everybody knows that the Chinese are oppressing the Uyghurs. But when you look at the analyses about why, people will say, well, it's a restive minority, there's separatist elements, there's Islamic radicalism, and of course there's the Belt and Road. And Xinjiang province is very important for Belt and Road because Belt and Road looks westward. All true. I mean, none of this is really 100% wrong, but I think it missed the strategic vector. The Chinese are barreling toward the Middle East with single-minded fervor, I would say, or ruthlessness, perhaps a better word, through Pakistan. Pakistan is the corridor through which they are trying to reach the Indian Ocean, and they want that for a number of reasons. One reason is they feel hemmed in by the United States and its allies to their east. China, because of this first island chain, you know, America's unsinkable aircraft carriers of Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines. The Chinese feel kind of landlocked, peculiarly for a country that has such a large frontage on the ocean, and so they want to break out to the Indian Ocean and break out from this kind of siege that the Americans have them under. Of course, that's another way of also flanking India to the west. But it's also about the Middle East, because this corridor is called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. It's the jewel in the crown of the Belt and Road Initiative. And the goal is to build highways, rail lines, and pipelines from Gwadar, a port on the Indian Ocean, up to Xinjiang. And what the Chinese are going to do they're going to do two things by building this corridor. One is they are going to shorten their sea lines of communication, their oil and gas supply lines, and also raw materials from Africa. They're going to shorten it considerably so they don't have to go through the Straits of Malacca and up to the east coast of China. They're going to go by land from Gwadar up to Xinjiang. And that puts the Uyghurs right on the, at the hub where the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor comes into China. They don't want a restive minority on such a strategic territory. And so they are oppressing them, in ways that we're all very familiar with now. I don't think many people understood the Middle East strategic dimension of these genocidal policies that they're carrying out. The other thing that I think I discovered, and I say I think I discovered, I argued it, I certainly believe it. I don't know how convincing the readers will find it. I hope they find it very convincing. But we argued that China is in an alliance, a tacit alliance with Russia and Iran. This is not the way Americans have traditionally understood China's role in the Middle East. The traditional understanding is that China is not challenging Americans in hard power terms or in even politically in the Middle East, that China is largely comfortable with the American order. All it wants to do is extract resources from the Middle East, and it benefits from the American order, and it knows that, and it's comfortable with it. We see it rather differently. We think that all of that is true, that China does benefit from the American order, and that China doesn't want to directly challenge the United States because of that. But that's only half the story, and it's not the most important half. It is also simultaneously opposed to the American order. It wants to create, it's out globally, and I think to an Australian audience, this is probably a pretty easy sell, that it's trying to create a Sinocentric global order. It wants to supplant the United States, and that inevitably means it wants to supplant it in the Middle East. Now, they know that for the time being, they are weaker militarily. They are vulnerable because of their supply lines. So they don't want to go about directly challenging the United States and risking all of that at this particular moment. But they do have a longer term plan. And so what they are doing is they're using the Russians and the Iranians as stalking horses. And the Russians and the Iranians are taking all the heat for being the agents who are directly opposing the United States. But they are supported in all kinds of ways by the Chinese. The Chinese have a military relationship with the Russians. They have a military relationship with the Iranians. They have an economic relationship with both. It's very important to both. They vote in all of the major voting in the Security Council. The Chinese follow the Russians on any major issue in the Middle East. So the formulation that we came up with for the Chinese role in the Middle East is that they are neutral on political and military actions against the United States. They have a facade of neutrality, while behind the scenes they are pushing the Russians and the Iranians to undermine us. That takes me back to Iraq, because there are lots of ways in which they benefit tremendously from the resistance alliance of the Iranians. I mean, Iran has made Iraq a very hostile environment for American business and for Americans. And I don't think it's an accident that the Iranians have created this, you know, kind of turned Iraq into a kind of a no-go zone for Americans, while the Chinese have come in and have swooped in and now have a major economic relationship with Iraq. They get a pass from the Iranians, of course. And this is then, once as the Chinese increasingly establish themselves as the tacit, you know, sort of silent partner of the Iranians and a major economic presence in the Gulf, well, then you find everybody else in the region is hedging towards them. The Saudis are hedging towards the Chinese, and even the Israelis are hedging toward the Chinese. The Israelis signed an agreement with the Chinese to build the port of Haifa. The Americans have repeatedly asked the Israelis not to follow through with it, and they so far have rejected it. And now, partly, I think it's because the Israelis, like the Americans for the longest time, didn't really see economic relations with China as dangerous in any way, and very lucrative. The Chinese make it very attractive to do business with them. And so we really have ourselves to blame, I mean, we the Americans, I think, for a lot of this hedging behavior. And it's not an easy, from a policy point of view, it's not an easy problem to solve, because I don't think we can compete, we the United States can compete with the Chinese in investment. We just can't. And you already see that with the Israelis and with in other areas. There's no way we can tell the Iraqis, hey, you know, just get rid of all this Chinese investment. I mean, we can do it, we can say it, but they won't listen to us. So what I think the U.S. has to do is has to realize that that its real asset in the contest with China in the Middle East is its hard power. It hasn't wielded its hard power in the most intelligent fashion. If the goal is to keep China at a distance or off balance in the Middle East, the single most important thing that we can do with our hard power is to destroy or severely weaken the Russian-Iranian alliance, which is the tool by which the Chinese are, you know, forcing the states in the region to start looking toward Beijing to moderate the Russians and the Iranians. So what the article ends up doing in the end is it presents two different pictures of the Middle East. I would say, for lack of a better term, I'll call it the Obama-Biden view of the Middle East and the Trump view of the Middle East, although that's not the way we put it in the article. The Obama-Biden view of the Middle East is that, you know, China is in the distance. We don't need to really worry about it. Like I said, you know, they're happy with our order. The problem is the Iranians and the Russians. How do we deal with the Iranians and the Russians? Well, we make them partners in regional security. We show them that we are not interested we show the Iranians that we're not out for regime change, and we're willing to work with them on issues like the Islamic State, stabilizing Iraq, and so forth. And we show the Russians as well that we don't have a problem with their presence in Syria or some of the other areas in which they're active. And we look at ourselves as sort of a chairman of the board sitting around a round table with our allies and with the Russians and the Iranians, and we treat them all as stakeholders, and we just try to stabilize the region in that way. And we argue in the article that doesn't work because the Russians and the Iranians actually want to drive America out of the region. And if you look at what's happened in Iraq, you can see that that is not a fanciful dream by any stretch of the imagination, because here the America made its most significant effort to reshape the region, expended a huge amount in blood and treasure, and look what's happening. The Iranians aren't exactly taking over, but they've cleared a space into which the Chinese have come instead of the Americans. So if you're sitting in Tehran, as bad as things are right now, and they're very bad, you can still imagine a world in which the United States is not the dominant power in the Gulf, and it's getting easier and easier to imagine that world. And that, so it's not, it's not as fanciful as it might sound at first. Second, the other view is the Trump view, and the Trump view sees, I think clearly Mike Pompeo sees the world in the way that we depicted in the article. But I would say that most of Washington doesn't. But I think we have depicted the Pompeo worldview, which is that China, Russia, and Iran are working to undermine the United States in the Middle East. Pompeo is very concerned about the lifting, according to the terms of the JCPOA, the lifting of the arms embargo on China in September. The United States is introducing Security Council resolution next week to prolong the arms embargo, because it can see very quickly this constellation developing against us. To me, this is the only position that makes sense. No matter whether we have a Republican or a Democrat in power after the election in November, no president is going to agree to another sort of large-scale military engagement in the Middle East, like a George W. Bush-style invasion of Iraq. The American public has demanded a lighter footprint by the United States in the Middle East. So the challenge is, how do we contain China and maintain a light footprint at the same time? I do believe it's possible. I believe that the combination of limited but very strategic use of American military power, like in the killing of Qasem Soleimani, coupled with covert action like blowing up the Natanz nuclear facility. I don't know if this was the Americans or the Israelis or some combination, but that kind of activity, combined with action by allies, such as what the Israelis are doing in Syria, what the Turks are doing against the Iranians and the Russians in Syria, what the Turks are doing against the Russians in Libya. All of that combined together with the massive economic sanctions that we have put on Iran, and from which Iran is suffering greatly, I think are sufficient, are all that is needed if used strategically and in a concerted fashion, are all that is needed to really defeat the Iranian-Russian coalition. And I don't believe the Chinese will try to step in and work directly against us for all of the reasons that I said. There's this contradiction in their policy. They benefit from our order while trying to undermine it simultaneously. What we need to do is make sure that they don't have the weapons to undermine it, and they have to fall back on their position of just accepting us for the time being. The real danger here in the long run, and I'll stop with this, I think this is all, you guys can see this also very clearly, is that the Chinese see the Middle East as an extension of the East Asian, of the Western Pacific theater of operations. Their supply lines mean that they are very concerned about if a war breaks out within the first island chain, that they could have their oil cut off by the United States and the Middle East, their oil and other strategic imports that they need. And so they want to position themselves so that that cannot happen, that their supply lines are shorter and harder, and they don't go through that first island chain to get to China. And they want to position themselves also to totally dominate the supplies of everybody else, including Australia. So one of the things we advocated in the article is that the Middle East balance of power should be a much bigger issue in discussions between the United States and the Quad, and indeed all of the East Asian powers that are dependent on Middle Eastern oil and gas, so that we don't blindly, with this doctrine this doctrine that's been floating around that China is quite happy with our position in the Middle East, that we don't blindly just sit back and allow the Chinese to build up the kind of capabilities that they have. They have a base in Djibouti, which is right on the Bab el-Mandeb. That's the strait through which that guards the approaches to the Suez Canal through the Red Sea from the Indian Ocean. That's the strait through which a very large percentage of Europe's oil goes by tanker out of the Persian Gulf. It goes around the Arabian Peninsula and up through the up through the Suez Canal. And they're building this port in Gwadar, the end of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, on the Indian Ocean, which they're presenting now as an economic activity, but that will absolutely, definitely, according to me, just by looking at the map, that's going to become a military installation. It's going to become a military base, and that is very close, or relatively close, to the Strait of Hormuz. It looks out, Gwadar looks out on the Gulf of Oman. And so they will position themselves to be able to close both of the major choke points for oil in the Middle East. If the United States picks up and leaves the Middle East, as some people on both the left and the right are talking about these days here in our crazy politics, the Chinese will swoop in a second. They will own the Middle East. They will own the entire global oil market, or they will be the dominant player. And that will be a major shift in the global balance of power. I think it should alarm everybody who cares about freedom. It's not hard to imagine what they would do with that economic power to start projecting their cultural and political power, as well as their military power, into all areas where Middle Eastern oil flows. And with that, I'll stop and I'll turn it over to you, Joel.
Thank you, Mike. That was truly fascinating. I appreciate it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the link to the article that Mike was discussing today is in the reminder email, and I'll have Ariel to send the link in the chat section of Zoom. So that will be available for you all as well. And what we'll do is, again, the question and answer facilitation is done via Zoom. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a participant tab which you can click. At the bottom of the list of participants, you'll have an option to raise your hand. So please don't be shy, raise your hand. You can also submit your questions in the chat, and then I will, if I have the time, I will ask them to Mike. Now, I'll get things started. I want to touch on something that you raised in your discussion and also the article, and that's Israel's relationship with China. Now, Israel's developed that relationship that has obviously raised flags, not just in Washington, but here in Australia as well. Now, you discussed the recognition of China's influence in Israel, with Israel hedging its relationships. What type of restrictions or constraints should Israel place on its relationship with China in a process of not alienating the United States as an ally?
You know, that's a great question, and I can only answer it. I can only answer it in general terms, not with the kind of specificity that I wish I could answer it with. And so, in general terms, I would put it this way: the key question is what is strategic trade and what is non-strategic trade. The Chinese have this program, the Made in China 2025 initiative, in which they announced that they want to become the global leader of next generation technology. You know, the artificial intelligence and other next generation technologies that are going to drive the global economy at the highest level for the next few decades. That alarmed. When they came out with that, it alarmed the world, and they backed away from it formally. But my colleagues who know something about China tell me that that hasn't actually, that they're no longer formally following Made in China 2025, but that's their de facto policy. So a country like Israel, which is a cyber superpower, it's a global leader in artificial intelligence. It's an innovator in smart weaponry, and so on. And it has an incredible understanding of the American techno-military complex. The Chinese would want nothing more than to have a very close relationship with such a country. I'm convinced that when the Chinese look at the Middle East, that It's not just the oil industry they're interested in. They see the little shine, you know, Israel is a bright shining diamond that they would like to have on their ring, and they would like to take it away from the United States. It could play a major role in helping them achieve their goals. So we together with the Israelis, I know these discussions have already begun. And we want the Israelis, we the Americans want the Israelis to set up what we call a CFIUS process. This is a process by which, a very cumbersome process by which the United States decides with regard to its own industries, what's strategic and non-strategic. We'd like the Israelis to have an analogous process so we can work that way. I think it would be a great idea if, I know that you guys have played a role in fostering the Australian-Israeli military dialogue. I think it would be a great idea if there was a three-way dialogue between Australia, Israel, the U.S., maybe a four-way, maybe get the Brits involved as well. All the countries that have major technical capabilities, cyber capabilities, a military relationship with the United States, trade relations with the United States and with China, but a concern about rising China, for them to get together and put some meat on this concept of what is strategic and what is not strategic. The problem we have with China, it's not like the Soviet Union. It isn't behind an iron curtain where it has a completely different economic system. In our peculiar genius, we have totally embedded our own economy with the Chinese economy. Decoupling is a great political phrase, but it's very difficult to actually carry out. And so we're going to have to. It's going to be some kind of messy process by which we come to these decisions. You guys have also been in the forefront of this. I mean, you were the first ones to sound the. I think you can correct me if I'm wrong. To sound the alarm about Huawei. For the longest time, it looked like, well, that was, the horse had already left the barn and there was no possibility of doing anything about it. But more and more, we're seeing that as people grow aware of the Chinese threat, they're willing to actually join the ban on Huawei. I'm speaking now about the British decision.
Thank you for that. I'll now like to hand over to Colin to ask the question.
Thanks, Joel. I'll be quick because I know there are plenty of other questions. But again, I just want to come back to a couple of items you raised in your very perceptive introduction, Mike. I have a piece today in the Canberra Times, and it deals with the fact that the arms embargo on Iran is due to expire within weeks, I think early October. And as you say, the US is trying to stop that with a resolution in the UN Security Council. What are the chances that could succeed? We know they're probably pretty low, but what is the stance countries like Australia should be taking in this regard? And also, could you tell us a little more about this incipient China-Iran deal, which encompasses a whole range of trade, economic, and it seems security and defense dimensions? How significant is that? And again, isn't this something that countries like Australia should be alarmed about? Certainly in terms of the behavior of Iran, we understand where China's going. And similarly, shouldn't this also be a matter of grave concern for Israel, especially in view of their rather benign attitudes to China so far, which I think are starting to realign in a more realistic way too, fortunately.
Right. Well, the Israelis have a kind of benign view of China historically, and again, just not to be misunderstood, the United States, I think has been very slow to wake up to the China threat. But the Israelis have been slow, but they've always been in the forefront on the understanding the Iranian threat. It's kind of reversed with Australia. I think Australia has been in the forefront, out ahead of everyone with regard to the China threat, but softer on Iran. You of course understand all this better than I do, but my impression is that the that the Australian government tends to see Iran more like the Europeans do than like the Americans do. It was interesting for me when I was there, you know, on the long march that you put me through, Colin, waking me up at 4:30 in the morning with a bugle. I gathered that, you know, being so close to Indonesia, there's a greater sense of sort of the Sunni Islamist threat in Australia, and Iran seems quite far away. But I think Iran is the greater strategic threat for all the reasons that I've been saying. And we don't want this arms embargo to be lifted. This is a perfect example of what's wrong with the JCPOA. It's under the terms of the JCPOA that the conventional arms embargo is being lifted. I mean, the Obama administration sold this deal to us, saying that it is solely about the nuclear question. It has nothing to do with anything else. Well, obviously that's false, because now they're opening the doors for China and Russia to march in and to build up the conventional military strength of the Iranians. And you can see very clearly from what I was saying earlier why they would want this, especially the Chinese. The Chinese would be very happy to give the Iranians the capability to make the Persian Gulf a no-go zone for hostile craft, or for anyone that they wanted to make it a no-go zone for, just like the Chinese are using these area denial capabilities within the first island chain to make it so difficult for America and its allies to operate militarily. I think that the world has to unite. When I say the world, the United States and its traditional allies have to unite behind denying Russia and China the ability to do this legitimately. Now, will they succeed? Will the United States succeed, you ask, next week with this Security Council resolution? I don't think so. I'm sure that I assume, I'll be happy to be surprised, but I assume that the Russians are going to veto it. The traditional way of doing it is the Russians veto and the Chinese abstain. We'll see what happens. But what Pompeo is threatening is that if that happens, then the United States will initiate the snapback, the snapback provision of the Security Council resolution that recognized the JCPOA. Written in, it's the one good thing that the Obama administration did with respect to the JCPOA. They created this mechanism by which any power that was a signatory to the JCPOA, they're actually signatory metaphorically speaking, because nobody signed anything, but that were participants in the JCPOA, they can activate unilaterally the snapback, and that will return the 6 Security Council resolutions that the JCPOA, the UN after the JCPOA held in abeyance. And those 6 Security Council resolutions make enrichment and reprocessing of fissile material illegal in international law. So it puts the entire Iranian nuclear program beyond the bounds of international law, and then all the provisions of the JCPOA will also be null and void. And so I expect that that's what we're going to see. We're going to see a veto next week, and then we're going to see the United States move towards snapback, and then we have to wait and see what the Russians and the Chinese are going to do with respect to the snapback effort of the Americans.
Thank you for that, Mike. And now I'll go to a question from the chat. What do you make of the silence of both Mideast governments and religious figures on the human rights abuses of Uyghurs?
It's stunning. It's stunning, actually. And it just shows that's one of the greatest signs of the extent to which the Chinese penetration of the Middle East has gone, how deep the penetration has gone. China is the #1 investor in every Persian Gulf country. the number one trading partner of every Persian Gulf country. The numbers, the investment in the Middle East by China has been rising even as it's been falling in other areas. So on the one hand, it's simply on the one hand it's the economic penetration of the Chinese, but also frankly it has a lot to do with the I would say the way that we, the United States, have mishandled the region. We have, you know, when Obama, it started with Obama, but I don't want to blame it all on Obama. I think there's a lot of blame to go around. I could take it back to, look, take it back to George W. Bush. It's hard for me to do that because I served him loyally, and I'm proud of everything that I did in the Bush administration. But looking back on it, I think we made some mistakes. The war in Iraq, we went in the war in Iraq against the advice of the three allies that matter the most when it comes to stabilizing the Middle East are Turkey, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. This is the magic triangle. None of them thought that going into Iraq made a lot of sense. Under Obama, we made this deal with Iran, which raised Iran up significantly, and not just the Iranian nuclear program, but also Iran's profile across the region. It opened up the door for Iran to start proliferating these militias all across the Arab world, and in Syria, in concert with the Russians, and then distributing to those militias precision-guided weaponry. And while we were doing that, reaching out to them on the nuclear thing, opening the door for them across Syria and elsewhere in Yemen, we hectored our allies. We hectored the Turks, we hectored the Israelis, and we hectored the Saudis. So we didn't, you know, what do our allies want from us first and foremost? They want security. That's the number one thing. They like America's hard power. And so we showed we showed that we were very ambivalent about providing them with security against their enemy, their major enemy. In the case of the Israelis and the Saudis, Iran. In the case of the Turks, we aligned ourselves with the PKK, and we told all of them that they were. We told all of them to sit down and shut up when they complained. I mean, if you behave like this as a superpower, then is it surprising that people start to hedge? To me, it's not. So they hedged in the direction of China, and the Uyghur question is the one that where you can see the most. In all the votes in the Human Rights Council, they vote with China. It's quite amazing. With the exception of Turkey, there's a greater public opinion in Turkey because the Uyghurs are a Turkic people. There's a greater public opinion on the ground that demands a little bit more of the Turkish government, but the Turkish government doesn't want to get on the wrong side of the Chinese on this either.
Thank you for that. I'll now hand over to Zach Ben Moshe.
Do you foresee that the increased presence of China in the Middle East and the impact that this has on Iranian and Russian foreign policies as accelerating a shift in Israel's relationship with other Arab states, such as Saudi Arabia?
Absolutely. You know, just going back to what I said a minute ago, the twin developments of the rise of Iran and the unreliability of the United States pushed Saudi Arabia and Israel together. They're closer now than they have ever been. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, Israel, there's a greater understanding in that they're basically sending the same messages to Washington. They have the same picture of more or less the same picture of the region. The Turks is a bit of a different question, and that magic triangle that I mentioned, the Israeli-Turkish side and the Saudi-Turkish side are not so happy, but the Israeli-Saudi base of the triangle is pretty happy. But there are limits there are limits to how far that cooperation can go. I mean, there's just there is a cultural gulf between the Israelis and the Saudis, a political gulf. Their capabilities are mismatched. They can be effective partners in stabilizing the region as long as we're there. You know, our job, the job of the United States, is to help generate a shared picture between Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and others, and then to assign roles and missions, moving everybody toward realizing that shared vision, and then being the shock absorber. You know, so example, between the Turks and the Israelis have an enormous amount of shared interest right now. They have a shared interest in driving, in weakening Iran. The Israelis want to drive Iran from Syria. The Turks certainly want to weaken Iran, particularly in Idlib. And so, but they're not working together, as far as I know, in any kind of direct way to make this happen. That's the role of the United States. The United States steps in, has conversations in Ankara, has conversations in Jerusalem, comes up with a picture of what we want. We want to make life miserable for anybody who's Iranian or anybody who is under the command of Iranians in Syria. And we use our own capabilities in coordination with the Turkish and the Israeli capabilities. And if the three of us are all kind of rowing in the same direction, you don't need the connective tissue necessarily between Ankara and Israel in order to get a much better effect. But you have to have the United States. That's what makes us indispensable in all this.
Thank you. I'll now like to hand over to Ida Lichter. We'll just unmute you there, Ida. Just stand by. Go for it. I'm still having some audio issues there, Ida. I've got your question in the chat, and I might just verbalize it to Mike. So how close do you think Iran might be to economic collapse and or regime change? Is China in place to avert Iran's collapse?
I hate to say I don't know, but I don't know. I asked this question of everyone that I think might have a good answer. And, you know, it's like the old joke about, you know, 2 Jews, 3 political parties. On this question, you know, if you ask 2 Iranians this question, you get 3 different answers. The most interesting answer I heard, and I am not, I'll just give it to you. I'm not in a position to judge it. But I was talking to a guy who's an Azerbaijan. He calls himself a South Azerbaijani. So he's an Iranian Azerbaijani who feels himself to be a representative of an oppressed people. And his view is that it's in very bad shape, Iran, the Islamic Republic, but it can go on for a very long time, precisely because of the not the sectarian, but the ethnic issues. You know, Iran has these compact minorities. You've got the Azerbaijanis and the Kurds and the Arabs and the Baluch and the Turkmen, and they're all bitterly opposed to the Islamic Republic, or at least there are pockets of bitter opposition within those communities, but they're not all weaved together and working with each other. And one of the cards that the Islamic Republic has to play in that mix is it can present itself to Persians as the representative of the status of the Persians within the system. So in other words, they can say to the Persians, you know, after us, the deluge. If you don't want to be dominated by all these minorities, then you have to stick with us. That doesn't necessarily create love and affection between the average Persian and the regime, but it does make people think twice about actually working to destroy the regime out of fear of the chaos that's going to come next. I found that to be a very interesting analysis. I'm not in a position to say whether, so in his view, Iran can limp on in this fashion, the Islamic Republic can limp on in this fashion for a very long time because of this ethnic politics. I don't have the view into Iranian society to understand how valid that is, but it's a really good reminder of how complex these things can be. What I know for a fact is that they are hurting. They're hurting badly, and they are having to make, they don't have the money to pay for everything that they want to do. They are having to cut back on all kinds of services and activities that they would like to not just not cut back on, but not to be seen to be cut back on. Because the one thing that the Iranians regime is very good at is always looking strong. You know, they'll always present themselves as being, you know, as what me care? I don't care. You guys go ahead, cut my fingers off. I don't need my fingers. I have other fingers. You know, this is always the way they talk. But they're looking weak. And they don't like that, and they can't help Hezbollah, they can't help their militias in Iraq to the extent that they want to. So their whole system is looking weak. But what I wonder is, you know, it's clearly it's a ship that's kind of listing way over to one side, but it may be able to list like this for a long time. I don't think that we, for a second, should ever assume that the economics alone or history is going to do our work for us. We have to remain vigilant and keep the pressure on them all the time.
So just, Guy, if I can go drilling a little bit deeper just on that, if I can take the liberty, because I'll attach back to one of Colin's questions and to Ida's. Is there a tangible connection between the hurt that the Iranians and the regime is feeling now and the recent announcement of this new China-Iran deal? Now, in your paper, you alluded to the fact that this has been in discussion for years before, even before the maximum pressure strategy of the Trump administration. But do you see that the announcement today is of something that is a remnant of what was discussed many years ago, or is this just politicking that the Iranians are promoting the fact that they have some type of security blanket, which is China, from that maximum security pressure, that maximum pressure that's being exerted by the United States through their sanction regime?
Yes, sorry, I forgot to answer that question before when Colin asked it. I am skeptical of what was announced in the New York Times. I'm not saying it's false, but it is a repackaging. Let's start with the politics of it, and then let's talk about the substance. The New York Times is in the Obama-Biden camp. It can't stand the Trump maximum pressure campaign. It wants to return to the JCPOA. The line that the New York Times is pushing on its op-ed page and in its news reporting is that Trump has pushed Iran into the arms of China, and this is a huge failure. This budding Iranian Chinese alliance is a huge failure for the Trump policy, and the antidote to this failure is to go back to the JCPOA. That's the line they're pushing. It's utter garbage. It's total nonsense. Even the New York Times had to admit in that article that the deal that they are talking about was first announced in 2016, immediately on the heels of the JCPOA. So what happened when the JCPOA was concluded? Well, two things happened. There was a Russian-Iranian military alliance in Syria, and Xi Jinping comes to Iran. He came to Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, but he came and announced this partnership, this infrastructure for oil, or infrastructure and defense assistance for oil partnership in 2016. So what the Iranians are doing right now is they are the New York Times story was based on a leak to the New York Times from Iran. So what the Iranians are doing is they are politicking against the US in the Security Council as the US is moving on this question of this arms embargo. That's what they're trying to do. And they're doing it together with the Democrats in Washington. What created the Iranian-Chinese relationship, there's nothing new here at all. What created it was the JCPOA. That's what allowed Iran to have it both ways, to be the enemy of the United States, to be proliferating all these militias across the region, and also to open up its economy, get all the sanctions relief, and also to have all of these other restrictions like the one that we're seeing come October, the lifting of the arms embargo. So American policy under Obama lets Iran and lets China have it both ways. The Trump policy does not, and that's why it's superior. What exactly is in that deal? We have to wait and see. If I know one thing about the Iranians, it's when their lips are moving, they're lying. When they snore, they lie. There's no confirmation of what they said about this deal coming from China. Right now, we only know it from Iran. So let's wait and see. There were all, this was 400 billion. They had all these aspirational numbers that were supposed to materialize when they announced the deal first in 2016, and they never materialized. So just wait and watch is what I would say.
Fair enough. Thank you for that. I'll now hand over to AIJAC's Naomi Levine. Just unmute there. Audio issues. Can't hear you, Naomi. Might have to switch the microphone. No, still not. Try again. I can hear you now. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. I just wanted to speak about or ask you about the horrific explosion in Beirut that we've seen this week, and we've all seen sort of footage and images of it. But I think there's more that we don't know than what we do know about it at the moment. One thing we do know is what a difficult situation Lebanon was in before this explosion. What are the implications going to be of having an even weaker, an even poorer, and an even more destitute Lebanon in the Middle East?
Well, what's happening? First of all, let me just say a few words about what happened. My working assumption is that the story is that a cargo ship full of ammonium nitrate went from, I think it was Belarus to, was on its way to Mozambique. The cargo ship was owned by a Russian businessman who's based in Cyprus. This is in 2013. The ship became distressed, docked at Beirut, and the owner, this Russian based in Cyprus, refused to pay for the cost of fixing the ship. The crew was held on the ship for about a year. Finally, the Lebanese, they became a kind of the crew was Ukrainian. This became a big political issue. Ukrainians called them hostages. The authorities in Lebanon were holding the ship and the crew until the owner paid for the necessary costs to fix the ship. Eventually, they let the crew go, and they impounded the cargo, and they stuck it in a warehouse, and it's been sitting there for six and a half years, and that is what blew up. So I don't think it was anything nefarious by Hezbollah. I certainly don't think it was an Israeli attack. It was just a result of the incompetence and corruption that comes from a system like the Lebanese system, which is dominated by Hezbollah, and particularly the port. The system of oversight in the port is lax because Hezbollah wants it to be lax, because it's through the port that Hezbollah brings in arms and other equipment that it needs in order to carry out its own independent policies. and it doesn't want any oversight from the government. So the port is the Wild West because Hezbollah made it that way. So what Hezbollah is trying to do right now is it's putting out two different stories simultaneously. One story is that this was an Israeli attack, which it's putting out not in its own voice. If it puts out in its own voice that it's an Israeli attack, then it has to do something about it. Doesn't want to do anything about it. So it's just having its rumor mill spread that kind of rumor. The other thing that it's doing is it's blaming it's blaming the explosion on the corrupt elite. And this is part of an older story. This has been going on in Lebanon for a long time now because of the economic collapse in Lebanon. There's been a kind of populist reaction against the elite. And what Hezbollah is trying to do is insulate itself from that and say, oh, it's those corrupt elite over there. It's Saad Hariri and his cronies, not us, Hezbollah. But Hezbollah is the guarantor of this system. It likes this sectarian spoil system. And it maintains it because it can make, it can give a little piece of the pie to everybody, and it can pretend when dealing with the outside world, like with the United States, that we enter into all these ridiculous relationships with the Lebanese, where we say, well, so and so is not a Hezbollah person, so we can deal with them, but the system is not built by Hezbollah, but it has been structured by Hezbollah so that it benefits from the system, so they can do whatever what it wants to do. So I think the goal for the Western world, for the United States and its allies, should be to certainly get the immediate humanitarian aid that people need to keep body and soul together in these very difficult times, but we should not allow Hezbollah and Iran to use our humanitarian sympathy as a battering ram to end the sanctions under which Lebanon's the Syrian economy and the Iranians are suffering. Those sanctions are there for a reason. It has to do with the fact that that there is this alliance between Hezbollah, the Syrian regime, and Iran. And I don't think we should lift any of those sanctions in any serious way until we can assure that Hezbollah will be disarmed and defanged.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, sorry about that technical difficulty. One of my batteries just died. We've got 2 quick fire questions to go. We have run a little bit over time, but that's okay. I'd like to hand over first to Anthony Cohen, and then we'll finish with Stuart Sontag.
Thank you for your talk, Michael. I just want to ask, India is certainly developing into a major military power and technological power, and would hardly appreciate a China-controlled Pakistan on its border. What role do you see India playing in all of this?
I can answer that really quickly because I don't know anything about India. But when in researching and writing this article, obviously its importance just jumps out at you and jumped out at me in the same way that it did to you. I'm not in a position to say anything really intelligent about India. I did, however, in researching the article, I read a few things and I talked to some people who do know about India. And basically, and I'm probably not telling you anything that you don't already know, but the Indians themselves, as I understand it, are increasingly alarmed by the aggressive Chinese behavior. on their border in Pakistan, in the Indian Ocean, and they recognize the threat. But there are different ideas in India about how to deal with it. They have their, traditionally, historically, they were non-aligned. There is a school of thought that's in India that says that India can actually function relatively well in a Sino-centric world. And so there is another school of thought that is increasingly looking to the United States and its allies. I shouldn't even talk anymore about it. It's absolutely crucial, obviously, by looking at the map, but it's just an area where I don't know very much.
Thank you, Mike. Now the final question we'll hand over to Stuart Sontag.
Hello. Yes, thank you, Michael. Terrific talk there and discussion. You spoke about the Chinese technological advances in AI, but already the US seems to be lagging, apparently, in some key military technologies, and hypersonic missiles, certainly missile defense, and even nuclear weapons. And we recently found out that the Iranians managed to successfully strike US bases in the Middle East in response to the Soleimani strike killing, with their own homegrown cruise missiles and drones. So moving into the future, do you think the US may lose its qualitative edge? Does this also have tie-ins to a sort of rise in internal dissent in the US, and possibly, a sort of another allied question is, are external actors, possibly the Chinese, possibly the Russians, encouraging internal dissent in the US to weaken them, possibly weaken their own academia? Thank you.
Thanks. I'm not a great expert on technology and weaponry. In talking to people who know about these kind of things, I think there's a sense that we can prevail over the Chinese in these areas if we stop helping the Chinese as much as we have been. I mean, we have opened up our research institutes to them. We have been less than vigilant in allowing them to steal intellectual property. They are economically vulnerable. It is true that they have a lot of economic weaknesses, and they have a need to produce jobs, and so the Communist Party, it is evaluated by its own population to a certain extent by its ability to actually generate economic growth. So I'm not in a position to say whether we are inevitably going to stay ahead or not stay ahead. But I think what I can say is that we're going to give it a shot. We should give it a shot, and maybe if we stopped helping them as much as we have been, we'll have a pretty good shot at it.
Thank you very much for that, Mike. It was so great to see you, my friend, and thank you so much for your presentation today. It was truly fascinating. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have time for today. Please tune in again to AIJAC Live Online on Sunday evening, 7 p.m., the 16th of August. Our next guest will be former Israeli ambassador and outgoing Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Israel, Yuval Rotem. Again, thank you, Mike, so much. Fantastic to see you. Ladies and gentlemen, wherever you happen to be, please stay safe, and we'll see you next time.